Hello everyone, here we will see notes of the death of the author. Introduction. The Death of the Author is an influential 1968 essay by the French literary theorist Ronald Barthes. This work is written by French literary theorist Ronald Barthes. But what does Barthes mean by the death of the author? What is the meaning of this work, essay? This important short essay was crucial in the development of post structuralist literary theory in the 1970s and 1980s. In the year of 1970 and 1980, this essay played a significant role in the history of English literature. As many English departments, especially in the United States, adopted Barth's ideas along with those of other thinkers such as Jacques Derrida. In those period, English department of various states, especially the United States, adopted Barth's ideas along with another famous writer Jacques Derrida. About poet. Ronald Gerard Barthes was a French literary theorist, essayist, philosopher, critic, and semioticist. His work engaged in the analysis of a variety of science systems, mainly derived from Western popular culture. His ideas explored a diverse range of fields and influenced the development of many schools of theory, including structuralism, anthropology, literary theory, and post structuralism. In English literature, we saw various methods or various periods. About them, what is structuralism, what is anthropology, and what is various literary theory. About those, our poet made many works, or he discovered many new ideas on those, especially those. He was a great critic in those period and engaged in variety of science system and what is a Western popular culture. About those, he gave importance in his work. Barthes is perhaps best known for his 1957 essay collection Mythologies, which contained reflection on popular culture. His main work called Mythologies, which was reflection on popular culture, especially focused on, already we saw, Western popular culture. Next, here we will continue with the summary of the great work, The Death of the Author. Barthes begins The Death of the Author with an example taken from the novel Saracen by the French novelist Honor de Balzac. This mainly taken, our poet is influenced by the French novelist Honor de Balzac. His work, his famous novel Saracen. Quoting a passage from the novel, Barthes asks us who speaks those words, the hero of the novel or Balzac himself. Here he asks various questions to the hero of the novel or the writer Balzac. If it is Balzac, is speaking personally or on behalf of all humanity. Here, who is speaking? Here our poet asking, does hero speak or the poet Balzac speak? Barthes' point is that we cannot know writing. He boldly proclaims is a destruction of every voice. Far from being a positive or creative force, writing in fact a negative. Here, Barthes said about his ideas, especially on negative way on writing of various works. Void, where we cannot know with any certainty who is speaking or writing. Sometimes we are not, if we see one work, we can't judge who wrote these, who is the speaker or author. Sometimes we also get confused as a reader. Indeed, our obsession with the author is a curiously modern phenomenon which can be traced back to the Renaissance in particular and the development of the idea of the individual and much literary criticism, Barthes point out, is still hung up on his ideas of the author as an individual who created a particular work. Here poet says, if we read any work, we totally believe them as a real heroes, but we should analyze instead of believing. So we speak of how we can dictate Baudelaire, the man in the novel of Baudelaire, the writer, but this scar of a definite origin or source of the literary text is a wild goose chase as far as concerned. Here, if we follow blindly our work, it looks like a wild goose. We are just like an animal who follows other animal for their prey. Here there is another famous argument. He said, our poet said, it is a readerly text, not the writerly. Poet mainly focus on the his statement. It is readerly text, not the writerly. Poet points out that some writers, such as the 19th century French poet Stéphane Mallarmé, have sought to remind us through their works that it is a language which speaks to us rather than the right author. The author should write with the certain personality. Writing is done by suppressing the author's personality in order to let the work be written. Most of the time when writer writes, he focuses on his personal life. Here our poet says it should not. The poet's personal life should not be presented in the work. Moving away from our traditional idea, the author Barthes begin to capitalize the word as if to draw a parallel with a higher entity like God can help us to see the relationship between writer and text in a new way. He says the poet should build a relationship between writer and text or reader and text, not to the writer and the text. In the traditional view, the author is like a parent who conceives the text rather as a parent conceive a child. In a traditional way, author or the writer is a final for each and everything. But new in modern ways or modern thinking, author is just writer, but text is important. The author does exist before the novel or poem or play, and then creates that literary work. Barth's radically new way of reviewing the relationship between the two, writer and the text, are born simultaneously, because whenever we read a literary work, we are engaging with the writer. Yes, it is of course. When we read a work written by some poet or some author, we follow them blindly. We keep connection with the text as well as the poet. Here and now, rather than having to go back to give our own example, 400 years to consider, Shakespeare, the Renaissance author, Shakespeare as writer, exists now in the moment. We read his works on the page in the 21st century. Here our poet says, by giving example of Shakespeare, the works of the writer never end. It keep on living when if the writer or the poet death after his death. Writing is a performative act which only exists at the moment we read the words on the page, because that is only moment in the page which those words are actually given meaning, and they are given their meaning by us who interpret them. Instead, then, we should think of not the author but the scriptor. We don't, when we read any work, we don't think he is just author, we think like he is a scriptor, he is each and everything. Barthes used the French scripture in his original essay, a rare French term which means essentially copyist. Scripture spelling is differ from English scripture. The real meaning of this word is copyist, just copying. We should not view a work of literature as a kind of secular version of a sacred text where the author is a god who has imbued the text with a single meaning. When what author says, we believe him as a god and we take it is in the same meaning what author means. Instead, the literary text is a place where many previous work of literature blend and clash. A host of influences and allusions, quotations is original. Instead, the text is a tissue of quotations. Barthes conclude the death of the author by arguing that imposing an author on a text actually limits that text. Yes, if we focus on the author, we give one limit to the whole text, because we have to view the literary work in a relation to the author who wrote it. If we think relation between the author and text, we really fail as a reader. Its meaning must be traced back the person who produced it. But writing for Barthes doesn't work like that. It's a tissue of sign which only have meaning when the reader engages with them. The meaning of the text lies not its origin but in its destination, and that in order for the reader of the text to exist and have meaning as a term. Analysis. The death of the author makes several bold but important claims that the relationship between author and literary text, that works of literature are not original, that the meaning of the work literature cannot be determined simply by looking of the author of that work. Instead, we as readers are constantly working to create the meaning of the text. Writing is the destruction of every voice, not the creation of the voice. Here, poet says, writing is the destruction of every voice. We should focus on the text instead of the author, which is how we tend to think of a creative art such as writing. The literary text is not original either. Indeed, every text is a tissue of quotation. Literature contains original thoughts. This may strike us as Barthes overplaying his hand. Surely, works of literature contain original thoughts, phrases, and ideas. Here, poet says the works or the text contain all original things, but we copy just the author and aren't literary just a string of quotations from existing works. But Barthes is interested in language throughout the death of the author. He gives importance to the language, the system of writing, all these important instead of the just thoughts. And it's true that in every work of literature, the words the author uses, those raw materials through which meaning is created, are familiar words and therefore not original, merely put together in a slightly new way. Here, he used new ideas in a new way, bold and influential. Our poet spoke his views in a bold and influential manner. The death of the author was a bold and influential statement, but its argument that numerous precursors, his emphasis on personality, for instance, had already been made almost half a century earlier by T.S. Eliot in his 1919 essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. Here, our poet spoke about T.S. Eliot's famous work Tradition and the Individual Talent. Although Eliot still believed in the poet as an important source of the written text, and in the middle 20th century, new criticism, particularly in the United States, argued that the text had meaning in isolation, separate from the author who produced it, and that searching for authorial intention in the work of literature was something of a red herring. The ideas in those days was totally changed, but our poet also chose his own way. The death of the author makes a compelling argument about the way our work of literature has meaning in relation to its readers rather than its author. We 21st century readers, here poet says there is a combination relationship between text and reader instead of text and writer. Dickens are not the same people as the Victorians who read his work when his author was alive. For instance, words change their meanings over time and take on new reasons. What happened? The work became famous after the poet death. It is also very influential to the reader. Compared to Keats' poem. However, we might counter Barth's argument by making a couple of points. The first is perhaps an obvious one, that is, need not to be an either or, and that the birth of the reader does not necessarily have to be at the cost of death of the author. We can read Keats' poem and try to understand what the young romantic poet meant by his words. He says it's not only the reader starts or reader birth when a poet die. Sometimes the change of ideas also followed in English literature. What he was trying to say as the author of the work, while also acknowledging the fact that Ode on a Grecian Urn has new reasons for us 2 centuries after it was written. The Ode on a famous Grecian Urn also mentioned that poet or the author will stay alive for many centuries till his work preserved or work keep on reading tissues of science. The second point is that viewing a work of literature as a mere tissue of science threatens to put it on the same level as a bus timetable or the telephone directory. They too contain nothing but familiar words, names, and numbers and are not original. Here he says bus timetable and telephone directory are having all the details, but there is no connection between one and the other. Likewise, works of the literature may in and main draws of familiar words and even familiar phrases. But great works of art put these words and signs into new combination, and there is a virtual infinite number of those which can create new meanings for us. The great work keep connection between all. If it is a writer, text, and reader, all those connected together. Relationship between author, text, and reader. We might view the relationship between author, text, and reader as a tripartite partnership rather than the bipartite one. All three elements are important in creating the text meaning. If I give a poem to my students, here poet says his own words. He gave one book without mentioning author name to his students. What happened? If I give a poem to my students and don't tell anything about his author, they can analyze the poem language and they try to determine its meaning, but knowing something about the author and their context may help to reveal new meanings which are not important in understanding the text. As soon as we know the poem is by Sylvia Plath and we can bring the details of her life and death to our reading of the poem, its meaning changes. Yes, by knowing the name of the author, it gives some different feelings to the reader, but without knowing the author's name, it is really analyze of the text. So we do not need to bear in mind who wrote a text and how that might be significant in creating its meaning, even if we also need to acknowledge, as Bates does, uh, that once his text is written and goes out into the world, it is no longer solely the property of a author. Poet's argument. Barthes argues that the meaning of the text is fixed or determined by the author, but it is instead created by the reader in the act of interpretation. He argues writing destroys every voice and points of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing, the work interpreted as even if the author says X is the way, since it is not explicit in the story, I choose something different. Yes, what the author says, we need not to follow all the same. We give importance to the text rather than the author. Conclusion. To conclude, in The Death of the Author, Barthes argued that writing destroys every voice and point of origin. This is because it occurs with the new functional process, which is practice of signification itself, its real origin in language. Death of the author theory allows the reader to think whatever they want of a piece of writing. This has allowed critics of alter the facts that are set out in a novel. For example, a critic may claim that a female narrator is secretly a male one, or even create their own events to explain certain aspect of a novel. Yes, it's up to author how he shows his own personal life or his background in its work, but we give, as a reader, we give importance to the text rather than the author. If you understood its notes and if you feel helpful these notes, let me know in the comment box. Also like the video and subscribe my channel. Thank you one and all.